Well, good evening, everyone, and good to see all of you, and thank you for this opportunity to speak tonight on a wonderful subject. I do like to write and study and work in the area of the doctrine of creation because I am excited about the fact that the God who created the heavens and the earth is the one who revealed himself to us through the Lord Jesus Christ. And so thank you for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about Genesis and what Genesis is saying to us. I am Dr. Ken Keathley. I always kind of feel a little odd whenever I'm introduced that way as a senior professor of theology. Truth is, I'm from the Ozarks of Missouri, and what that means is that I'm a hillbilly that's read a book, and so I am delighted to be with all of you and to have the opportunity to just share with God's people from God's Word. Nathaniel does work at the Bush Center with and for me, and I just want to say that he does a great job, and I'm always pleased with the way that he works and the work that he does, and I just want to say how much I appreciate Nathaniel, and I am convinced that you are very blessed to have him as your pastor, and so I just want to say how delighted and pleased I am with Nathaniel. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Are there 10 more famous words in the world? I kind of doubt it. I suspect that people all over the world, no matter where you go, have heard those words, even if they don't really know even where they came from, because it's such a famous opening. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It is such a spectacular success that we don't realize just how radical and how revolutionary those words were at the time they were written. In fact, we just think it seems kind of obvious that if there is a God, then He created us, and if there is a God who is transcendent, then everything there is the product of that omnipotent being. So the first 10 words just seem sort of straightforward, obvious. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What I'm hoping to do is to maybe change our thinking about that. Because I'm hoping that what we can do is to understand just a little better what it would have meant like to Hebrews wandering through the wilderness to hear those words spoken to them from the book of Genesis the very first time. Now, anytime we read a text or we hear somebody talk, we are generally able to discern the difference between what a person says and what a person means. In fact, whenever people examine text or they try to understand how language works, they will make 3 distinctions. They'll talk first about what a person says, and then they will say, then there's also what a person means, or what a text says, and here's the meaning of that text. You say, well, what's the difference between what someone says and what someone means? Well, here's a good example. Boy's playing video games in the morning there in front of the TV. And as he's playing video games, his dad walks into the living room and he says, the trash man's going to be here in 30 minutes. And turns and walks out. Now, what did he say? The trash man will be here in less than an hour. What did he mean? Yeah, take out the trash. You see, you all catch on. In fact, you better figure out the distinction between what is said and what is meant really quick if you plan on getting ahead in life at all. Think of the newlyweds. And he says to her after a while they've been married, and he says, hey, my old friend said, invited me over to go out with him tonight. Sweetheart, I think I'll go out with him now. What do you think? And she says, you go right ahead. Okay, now what did she say? And what did she mean? Yeah, you better not go. Yeah. So understanding the difference between what is said and what is meant is just pretty obvious. And I say pretty obvious. It's not as obvious as some of us fellas. I mean, I can think sometimes my wife, has said to me, you didn't catch on nearly as quickly as you should. And I have to admit that she's right. I was reading about a fellow the other day said, his wife screamed at him, you haven't been listening to a single word I said. And I said to her, that's a strange way to start a conversation. And so you have those instances where the communications just hasn't happened the way that it should have been. Well, okay, are there places in the Bible that we see the distinction between what is said and what is meant? And the answer is all the way through. Think of Jesus' first miracle at the marriage supper of Cana. And there, as they are in celebrating, they run out of wine. And in fact, that is what Jesus' mother, Mary, says to Jesus. They have no wine. Now, that's what she said. What did she mean? Well, Jesus understood very well what she meant, because he said, woman, what is that to me? My hour has not yet come. And he went ahead and alleviated the situation by turning the water into wine. And so it's very clear that he understood the distinction between what was said and what was meant. But most who understand and look at language ask a third question, and that's the question I want us to pay attention to tonight. And that is not only the distinction between what is said and what is meant, but also what is he doing? What is the text intended to do? What was Moses trying to do with what he wrote? You said, well, I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Explain it a little further. Well, my wife and I, we love watching British murder mysteries. I mean, I need to go over here because it's being recorded, isn't it? We enjoy watching British murder mysteries. Miss Marple or anything Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot, Inspector Morris. There's just all kinds of really good British murder mysteries. In fact, if you watch British murder mysteries, you can be convinced that about every fourth Englishman is a killer, because they have all of these sweet little villages. They're going to have a murder. In fact, if this was a British murder mystery episode, before the episode is over, one of us would keel over dead, and we would all be suspects. I mean, that's just the way those shows are. Well, there's this one show that we've really enjoyed because the vicar, the preacher, is the one who solves all the murders. Well, in this show, there is this detective who wanted to get a promotion, and he's angry at his captain because his captain wouldn't let him have the promotion. So he's very resentful, very angry. And it was just so happened that the captain of the police station was also having an affair with his secretary. And so they were having the Christmas party, and everyone was there, the detectives, the staff, and the wives. And so as they were all in the party mingling, and there was the captain and his secretary talking to some other, and there was the captain's wife talking to some other people, and the resentful detective was walking around, and he walks over to the wife. He talks to her for a while, and then he points over at the captain and his secretary. He said, "Isn't it remarkable how often they work late at night?" And then walked away. Now, what did he say? They work late. What did he mean? They're having an affair. What was he doing? He was getting revenge. He was using his words as weapons. He was using his words for the purpose of inflicting harm. And so you can't just look at what a text says. You can't even just look at what a text means. You also have to ask, what is a text doing? And that's what I want to ask tonight as we look at this passage of Scripture. There are some people who treat the Genesis chapter 1 as if it is abstract theology. Now, I teach theology. I teach systematic theology. And so I understand people seeing Genesis 1 as that, where it's just something dropped out of the sky, giving us a pristine revelation that explains to us what we hitherto would not know in a way that just, wow. Well, it is revelation from God. All Scripture is given by inspiration. And so therefore it is the infallible, inerrant Word of God. So I understand people seeing it that way. But the thing we need to remember is that all of the Bible is written in a context, in a situation. Almost all of the Bible is as a narrative. You think about it, even the letters in the New Testament are written to a particular church for a particular reason. It says to the church at Corinth, to the church at Thessalonica. Even the book of Romans, that's the closest we have to what we'd call a systematic theology that just presents doctrines in a pristine way. But even that was a missionary letter written to the people at Rome when Paul was on his way to Rome and explaining why he was going there. So even then, we see that it is in a situation. It has a context. And so what we have to realize, it isn't just something abstract. It isn't just like an encyclopedia entry. Or it isn't just like a chapter in a chemistry textbook. Or it isn't just like a philosophical abstract idea and you're reading about it in a chapter. No, it's in a very definite context. And so as good as it is to say that it's abstract theology, that doesn't quite get at what Moses is doing. And then there are those who think it's the exact opposite. There are those who say it's just simply pagan thinking appropriated. When you read Genesis chapter 1, it tells the first 6 days of creation. Chapter 2 says the seventh day. What is it? What's the rest of chapter 2 talking about? Guess what? It's not about day 8. It's not day 9. In fact, what you're surprised whenever you read Genesis chapter 2, it tells the creation story all over again. Well, there are those on the more liberal side of the aisle who see the book of Genesis like they see the whole Bible, just as these antique, ancient myths in which they globbed onto this one and took a little bit over there. And so what you have is that they borrowed from all of these various myths and tied them all together. And so what we have in Genesis is something that looks like a literary Frankenstein. Just patch together a whole bunch of stories. And they'd say, well, look at Genesis 1 and 2. Here you have two different creation accounts clommed together, two different traditions, two different myths. And whoever put it together didn't even bother to straighten it out. You don't find anybody really holding to that anymore, but about 100 years ago, that was a really predominant way of understanding the book of Genesis. What most people understand today is that Genesis really is, just like the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, are crafted and put together in a remarkably precise way. And so the author, and I believe that author to be Moses, had a very good reason for doing things the way that he did. And so I don't think that calling it appropriation is enough. And then there are those who try to say that Genesis is simply an accommodation. Now, what is an accommodation? Well, it'd be like Nathaniel tonight, whenever he's putting his kids to bed, and he's trying to tell them a story from the Bible. And as he tells the story from the Bible, he wants to make sure he tells it at a level in which they understand it. And so that's the idea of accommodation. John Calvin, where we get the idea of Calvinist, John Calvin was the one who advocated this position. He said that Genesis is a lot like a nursing mother talking baby talk to her infant. And so therefore, we should not try to understand anything that is all that sophisticated from Genesis chapter 1. Well, yeah, I agree a little bit with that. In other words, I do think that the Bible, in fact, all of the Bible is an accommodation. In that sense, God does condescend down to us and communicate to us in terms and language and concepts that we can understand. But I don't think that's all it is. I think there's more going on than that. And so I don't think saying it's an accommodation is enough. And then there are those who argue that Genesis is a polemic. Now, what do we mean by polemic? It's an attack. And what they notice is all through Genesis 1, and this is something that will slip right by an American in the 21st century, is that each and everything in Genesis chapter 1 deals and addresses with a pagan god or goddess that was worshipped either by the Babylonians, the Canaanites, or the Egyptians in the surrounding cultures of the Hebrews. And so what you have in Genesis 1 is an attack in which it is saying just how wrong all of the pagan mythologies are. Well, that is going on. It is definitely some of that. But I don't think Moses is just angry at all the other people. He isn't just preaching against, you ever listened to a preacher that was mad? You ever sat through a preacher, listened to a preacher that just, had something, maybe a chip on his shoulder about something and he decided to straighten something out? That's not pleasant, I have to say. I've experienced that a time or two in my life. I don't think that's all that's going on in Genesis chapter 1. He isn't just mad or upset with all of the cultures and pagans around him. No, what I'm arguing is that Genesis is contextualized. Genesis as contextualization. Now, Nathaniel and I are at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of, if not the premier missionary school in the world. To put that in context, there are 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. And of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, we send out more missionaries than the other 5 combined. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. This is just our history. It's our culture. It doesn't hurt the fact that we're just down the road from Richmond. And so we have which is where the headquarters for the International Mission Board is located. And so we have just to have that close location. But as a result, he mentioned North Wake, and that is where we attend. It's a church right outside of it's about a mile away from the seminary, and several of the elders of the church are faculty at the seminary. And in fact, whenever you look at our elders, there's Ben Merkel, he was a missionary in Southeast Asia. There's George Robinson, he was a missionary in Central Asia. And we can just go down the line. There's Sam Williams, he spends half his year in South America as a missionary. And so we have a lot of missionary thinking going on at Southeastern Seminary. And one of the things we think about a lot, think about this. What would it be like if you had the opportunity as a missionary to reach a people group that has never heard the gospel before? And there you are in that isolated place, and it's your job now to present Jesus to them, to tell them the gospel. Now, if you try to say, the Lord is my shepherd, here's the problem. They don't know what sheep is. They don't know what a shepherd is. They don't know what farming is. They don't know what shepherding is, because they're in an isolated... How do you do this? How do you translate Psalm 23 to a group like that? And so those are the kinds of challenges and things that people think about whenever they think, I'm going to have to communicate the gospel. And there's 3 things that someone who is going to present the gospel to those who've never heard it, not only they've never heard it, they think entirely different than you. There are 3 things that you have to do. You have to let their context determine the questions. In other words, you have to start wherever they're at. Have you ever noticed how all through the Bible that is the way that the gospel is presented? Always start wherever they're at. Whenever, on Christmas, which we're getting ready to celebrate, whenever the shepherds who were Jewish and they had the Bible, how was the message of Christ's birth announced to them? Angels appeared. How about the wise men, the Magi, who had no Bible, no exposure to the Old Testament, very little of no understanding? It was through a star. It was through nature. God met them wherever they're at. If you'll notice in the book of Acts, whenever Paul preached to a synagogue, he started with the Bible and presented Christ to them. Anytime he was preaching to pagans, he started with nature and pointed out that even nature shows that there is a God. In other words, wherever they're at, that's where you have to start. Now, that sounds obvious, but that's a big challenge. And then the second thing you have to do is that you then have to use terms grammar and expressions that they will understand. Now, think about what a challenge that is. Think about all of the terms that you use, and we think, well, that's just where the Bible come up with. No, the term covenant, that was a term used in the culture around them. Even baptism. No, the church didn't invent baptism. There were cultures, there were religions that practiced baptism before we did. Even the word church, it's a borrowed term. There's just not hardly a concept that you have in the Bible that wasn't contextualized. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you think, why does it say that way? Because the Greeks of that day, they had a whole philosophical system developed around the concept of the Word and how the Word is the personification of God. And so it was a very convenient term to use. But John, notice what John does. He doesn't just use the term. Notice the three things. You start wherever they're at, and then you use terms they'll understand. And then the third thing, and your answer subverts their worldview, completely turns their world upside down. And that is what not only Paul did and John did, that's what Moses is doing here. You say, well, can you give me an example? What are you talking about? Well, in the few minutes I have left, let's just talk about how radically different, how very strange Genesis is in its context. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis tells us about the origin of the earth. The other texts, all the other texts, whether it's the Babylonian myths, the Egyptian myth, the Canaanite myths, they all tell us about how the gods originated. In none of the other myths were the gods eternal. None of them were the gods transcendent. In all of the other myths, their deities were finite. They may be powerful, but they were finite. And they were inside what we would call the world. And it would tell about, in fact, that's the thing in verse 2. Oh, I'm wanting to walk around. I'm going to have to be careful here. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you'd think he'd go right into day one. And he said, let there be light. And there was light. And he called the light day. That's what you expect. But that's not what verse 2 says. You know, verse 2, to you and me, if we were just to be a little honest, it's a bit strange. Notice what verse 2 says. In verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Notice it was without form. It was formless. It was void. It was dark and deep. That's a strange way. You think, okay, God created the world and there... No. At first, it seems these four strange things. That brings up the second thing I'm going to say. In the other text, the oceans created the gods. Notice in verse 2, Moses flips that. You see, the ancient Egyptians believed there were four, they called it the Ogdod. And those four things is what created the creator deity. What was it? It was the formless chaos, the empty void, the darkness, and the ocean depths. Those were the four primal realities that has been here for all eternity. Forever. And from that bubbled up Ptah. And that is how he then starts creating all of the other deities that become the sky and the air and the moon and the sun and the stars and the trees and everything else. So what you have is Moses flipping that, saying, These four things did not make the Creator God. The Creator God is the one who made these four things. And so what you and I see as obvious, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Not obvious to them. That was a slap in the face to have it read the way that it is in these two verses. Third thing you need to see is in all of the other texts, it's about how it's all about warfare. It's all about battle. Notice in Genesis, there is no struggle. God says, let there be light. There's light. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. Brings forth vegetation. Let there be animals. There's animals. There's no struggle. There's no opposition. There's no warfare. In the Babylonians, did y'all ever watch maybe Lord of the Rings? You ever see those movies? Do you remember the struggle, the warfare there? Well, I've often wondered why they never made a movie or a miniseries about the Babylonian creation myth. It is an ugly, nasty, terrible, slaughtering. Hollywood should love it. I mean, it's the kind of story, it's got murder, it's got betrayal, it's got sex, it's got intrigue, it's got everything. According to the Babylonian creation myth, there was the primal waters, the fresh water and the salt water. The fresh water was the male, the salt water was the female. Fresh water enters into the salt water, they bring forth all. And so you have these various deities. You have Ea, the god of wisdom. You have the god of this and the god of that, a whole generation of them. And then the next generation, they had a whole other set of generation. And then you have a fourth generation, which Marduk, who's going to be the hero of the story, is finally born. 4 generations of gods, goddesses, and deities. And we're talking about gods, goddesses, everything. Well, you have the original, you have the saltwater goddess is Tiamat. And you have the freshwater god, he's Apsu. And so it's Apsu and Tiamat are the great-grandparents of all of these gods and goddesses. And guess what? Apsu, for whatever reason, decides he's tired of them. This was a mistake. I'm going to kill them all. Now, that's a pleasant story, don't you think? And so he says, I'm going to kill them all. And so he plans on killing his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. But Ea, the god of wisdom I mentioned before, he gets wind of the plot. And so he sneaks into the palace and he assassinates his own dad. Now, he kills his dad. Everybody's upset with him until he explains, look, here's what he's going to do. He's going to kill us all. And they said, well, okay, what can we say? And so they're having that kind of conversation. And that's when Tiamat finds out that her husband has been murdered by their son. Well, Tiamat is much bigger, much greater, and much stronger than her husband Apsu. In fact, she has the form of an enormous dragon. This is a mythology, just telling you how the story goes. She is outraged. In fact, she's so outraged that she creates and builds this enormous army to kill all of the gods and goddesses. And it goes through all of the various demon men and scorpions and dragons and lizards and all of the various things. I mean, just all of these various entities that are just this enormous army. It's horrible. It's terrible. And so whenever the gods hear there's an army headed towards you, they send a scout. And when the scout looks and sees this horrible army headed towards him, it says he's so terrified that he can't speak. He can't think. I mean, it's just awful what's headed towards him. This isn't really what you expect from Genesis 1 now, is it? Let's face it, this is really different, isn't it? Now, you got to remember, folks, this is the worldview and the thinking that Moses is writing into. And so now they're all terrified because this horrible army is headed towards them. They don't know what to do. Well, they turn to Marduk, who is their young, strong, handsome, incredibly powerful God. And he said, can you help us? Looked like, I don't know, Nathaniel. Just really just a hunk. And so he's just really amazing. And he says, yeah, I can defeat her. And he said, okay, do, please. And he said, I've got one condition. What is that one condition? Everybody obeys me absolutely from now on. Is that all you want? We'll do it. We will all serve you. And so all the gods and goddesses agree that they will serve Marduk. And Marduk, they have this horrific battle. And it's in graphic. I mean, it talks about skulls being crushed and veins being severed and blood splurting everywhere. And it's just this gruesome, horrible battle. And the general for Tiamat is her lover, Quingu, who this is like I said, it's a fairly sordid story. And he gets captured, and Tiamat is killed when Marduk takes an arrow and he shoots it into her mouth, and he kills her. Then he takes his sword and he splits her in half. You're probably asking me, what in the world does this have to do with Genesis 1? Well, at this point, when he splits her in half, the lower half of her, he makes the earth out of it. The upper half of her, he makes the sky. The lower half is the fertile part. That's why it's the earth. The upper part is the stars and the sky and everything you see. And so that is how the heavens and the earth are formed according to the Babylonians. Now all the gods and goddesses, they have to serve Marduk on the earth, and they hate it. They hate it. And so they come back to him and said, look, we said we'd do whatever you told us to. But we're gods and goddesses. We really shouldn't be having to do all this. Can't you make slaves for us who can obey and do what we say? And he says, yes, I can. So they go over to Quingu. They had Quingu bound up in chains. And Ea, the god of wisdom, and Marduk take a knife and they slit his throat. And as his blood gushes out, they take the blood and they fashion it and they start making humans. And it says, I will compact blood. I will cause bone to be. Let man be his name. Let him serve to relieve the gods of their burden. And so, in the Babylonian myth, humans are slaves. Our purpose in the world is to be obedient servants and do whatever our masters say. Now, this is what the stories. In the Egyptian account, it was all about, I won't even go into the detail about how the Egyptian god created everything. He would sneeze. He would spit. He would do every bodily function, some of them X-rated. And that's how he created the world. And then whenever he cried, that's whenever he fashioned humans out of his tears. And that's the role humans played in the Egyptian creation narrative. So, in the other text, it's all about warfare. In Genesis, there is no opponent. Genesis deifies nature. That's another thing you have to understand. In the ancient world, they didn't have a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. They believed everything was alive, not just plants, not just animals. They believed the sky was alive. They believed the moon was alive. They believed that the stars were alive. They thought the stars ruled over us. That's why they wanted to check about their horoscope. That's why it says something so very big and important when Moses just gives 5 words. He made the stars also. That's it. Letting us know that the stars don't rule over us. You don't have to worry about your horoscope. They're not in control. The sun and the moon, he doesn't even name them. The greater and lesser light. You don't have to worry about them as deities. In fact, we think of the natural world and the supernatural world. You know why? Because you and I live on this side of Genesis. It's Genesis. In fact, we're going to have a conference in the spring with a bunch of historians here, and they will all tell you that it is because of the book of Genesis and the Christian worldview that the scientific revolution was able to happen. Because it required the de-deification in the Egyptian way of thinking, in the Babylonian way of thinking, You think about it. Inside your body, you have trillions of cells. For every one human cell you have, there's a bacteria. You have as many bacteria living in you as human cells. Now, that's kind of a creepy thought, isn't it? Now, so in other words, you're only half as heavy as you think you are. Because actually, about half of your cells are actually... Now, you have some little microbe living in your stomach. Do you ever worry about him? Do you ever think about him? No, you don't. Not unless he's giving you trouble. And that's the way the Egyptians and the Babylonians thought that humans were. And in fact, they understood humans to be like microbes inside a big body. We are surrounded by living things. Just like if you were a microbe living inside a human body, there would be all these vital organs and all of these, everything would be alive. That's the way the Egyptians saw the ancient world. Everything is alive. So when you felt the breeze going by, that was Shu, the god of the air. Everything was alive. Moses says, no, there's only one God, and creation ain't him. So, in other texts, as I've already said, we're slaves. That's all we're meant to be. Why do you think Pharaoh could have millions of people work to build his cemetery, his graveyard, that pyramid? Why do you think he can have millions of people spend all their lives working to build a pyramid for him? Why do you think the Babylonians could amass an army of hundreds of thousands to invade us? Because Marduk kills. Marduk defeats. Marduk goes to war. So if you're going to worship Marduk, how do you do it? You kill. You pillage. You slaughter. You defeat. What do we have in Genesis 1? We have a God who enters into covenantal relationship with us, who lovingly creates and fashions this world. And he says, let us make man after our image. And male and female made he them in his image. And he blessed them and enters into a relationship and says to them that they are to be the vice regents. They are to be his ambassadors. They are to be his representatives, his stewards here on earth. Whenever you realize this, you begin to realize just what a radical, strange lesson Genesis 1 was to all of the original hearers. In fact, ask yourself this. Why is it in Exodus chapter 20, you have where God himself meets with the people of Israel? I mean, God shows up in a great cloud, fire and thunder. And it's so terrifying, they say, we don't want to ever see this anymore. Let Moses speak for us. And God says, that's fine. And so Moses goes up on the mountain. Now think about it. How many people have you ever heard say, if God would just reveal himself, then I'd believe in him. If God would just show himself in an unambiguous way, well, then I would just obey and serve him. Ask yourself this. Why is it that when Moses went up on the mountain, in less than 6 weeks later, they were worshiping a golden calf? 40 days, Moses comes back and they're worshiping. You know why? They thought they were doing a good thing. That's how they understood things. You and I think more like Moses than did his original audience. Moses is talking to people, when he writes this writings, people who've lived 400 years in Egypt. They are thoroughly marinated with pagan Egyptian thinking. And if you don't believe that, just read the Old Testament. They were incurable idolaters. In fact, it was so bad that they end up being judged for it and sent into exile back to Babylon. And this is the message of Genesis. Genesis tells us, unlike the Egyptians, unlike the Babylonians, unlike the Canaanites, there is one God, transcendent above all things, who's created all things freely and lovingly. We are the capstone. of his creation, in his image, and we are his vice regents, given a commission. And what you have, instead of an ethic of warfare and bloodshed, it is an ethic of covenantal love. Genesis 1 is a message of grace. It is the gospel according to Moses. It teaches an ethic much like the Sermon on the Mount. And when we understand Genesis in this way, it lets us know this is a radical story. So, anytime anybody says, why in the world does Moses write the way he did? Why does he sound like the Canaanites and the Egyptians? And we'd say, it's because he was a very good missionary. And Genesis chapter 1 was a smashing success. And we, the whole Western world, is living proof of that.